Hello and welcome to the second episode of Hope. We are here in conversation with Mr. Gurcharan, a public intellectual, a former CEO of Procter & Gamble, India, and later managing director of Procter & Gamble worldwide, a global leader indeed. Mr. Das took an early retirement to become a full-time writer, choosing to follow his passion by all means. He has inspired many and is continuing to inspire many more. A very humble, generous, and a joyful person at heart, we introduce you to Mr. Das. Thank you so much for joining in, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So, sir, with the United Nations celebrating its 75th anniversary, how can each individual within themselves and around help create a better world?
I believe that, we're going to talk today about education and how education can help us. And frankly, the whole idea of being human is to lead a happy and fulfilled life. Education should help us in doing that. Now, my one-line definition of happiness is to love the work you do and love the person you live with. Now, as regards the loving the person you live with, well, I'd suggest you read my book, Karma, the Riddle of Desire. But today, on UN Day, let's focus on loving the work you do. The odd thing is, Jahnavi, that so few of us love our work. That's why you have restaurants like, thank God it's Friday, TGIF. They are successful because people just want to get out of work and they live for the weekend when they don't have to work or a holiday. The problem begins when we are young. Our parents say, go to school, get high marks so that you can get a job. They're concerned with us making a living, whereas education should help us make a life. And so we follow our parents and we get a job and we get married and we have children and we do the same thing with our children. But when we get to be about 40, 50 years old, we suddenly wake up one morning and we ask, is this what life was all about? And there's a sense of despair that have I wasted my life? Now, education should really teach us how to make a life, not just to make a living. And therefore, it's our duty for us all as parents, as grandparents, as teachers, to bring up our young people to discover how to make a life, to discover a passion where you love your work. We are not born like Mozart, who at the age of 4 knew he was a musical genius. Most of us stumble onto our passion, stumble onto making a life. And that is really central. And I can only, the only true data of history is your own life. That's what you know for sure. And I just thought I'd give my example of my life. It's not the only one, it's certainly not the best, but it's an example of someone who did try to make a life. So when I went to college, my parents were typical middle-class Indian parents, and they wanted me to make sure I made a living when I came out. And so I was told, my father was an engineer, so I went there to do engineering. But at college, I discovered the humanities. I discovered literature. I discovered history. I discovered philosophy. And finally, I got a degree in philosophy. So I was on my way to go and do a PhD in philosophy. And just before I went to do my PhD, I suddenly got cold feet. And I said, do I want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought? So I decided no. And so again, I was at a loose end. I didn't know what to do. And so I thought I'd experiment. The one thing I knew was that I wanted a life of action and not a life of thought, at least not only of thought. And so here I had been groomed to be a high thinking Brahmin. And suddenly I got a job by answering an ad for a company. So I became from a high thinking Brahmin, I converted to a money making Banya. And so I reinvented my life. But the idea, the intellectual urge, etc., the questioning mind continued. So I arrived at a compromise. And the compromise was to use my weekends when my friends in business played golf. I wrote, I began to write, and I became a weekend writer. And that's what I've been all my life. I've worn two hats. And by the time that I asked the question in my 40s, I went into a business career, but Monday to Friday, I was a businessman. Saturday and Sunday, I was a writer. I was a weekend writer. And so by 50, when I asked the question, is this what life was all about? I had an answer that I could become a writer because I had enough savings by then and children were grown up. So responsibilities were over. And so I became a writer. Now, I'm just giving you as one example of how to make a life. And there are many ways. But to me, life is about creating yourself, not finding yourself. That's Mozart's can do. But for ordinary people, we can create our life. And that's what I did. And so I wanted to tell you that the reason why this was possible is because of the type of education I got. I got an education in which I was made to think critically, to ask the questions why, and it was very fortunate that I got this education. Unfortunately, most Indian children are not so fortunate. We go to school and we go through a rote learning, memorizing process. And thank God, the new education policy that has just been announced has made it very clear that they want to junk rote learning, no memorizing. It's all about asking questions,
Yes.
thinking critically, keeping alive that childhood curiosity.
Yes, sir.
To know what the world is all about.
Yes, sir. So, along the same lines, now that you've spoken about the education system in India, I have a question to ask. So, in terms of this Indian education system, with equal regard to the current scenario that we are in, what are the ground level crises that we as a country are facing? Because I read one of your articles, and the 1.5 cheers for the new education policy, and it did speak about the education crisis. So, if you could just give us a overview.
Well, the good news is that almost all children are now in school. So the issue of quantity, of getting numbers, getting enough schools in the country to have enough places for children to sit down and study, desks, etc., that problem is solved. The problem is quality. Only about 10 to 15% of Indians' children get an good education. And the rest, I'm sorry to say, are condemned to a pretty mediocre, or almost, I would say, a pretty horrible education. And now the new education policy has a lot of good things. One of the things was, as I told you, junking rote learning and memorizing in favor of critical thinking, creative thinking, conceptual thinking. There's also emphasis on vocational skills. That's good.
Yes, sir.
And the other good thing is that it separates governance, meaning the regulatory function of government, from running the government schools. That removes the conflict of interest. Now, what is wrong with Indian education? And I'll give you 8 facts that will practically make you jump out of your chair and fall down. So the first fact is that 1 out of 4 teachers is absent in a government school across the country.
Yes, sir.
And 1 out of 2 who's present is not teaching. And this is not authorized absence. This is illegal absence of teachers. Now, the reason why teachers are absent is not because the salary in a government school is bad. In fact, thanks to the 6th and 7th Pay Commission reports, a starting teacher today in India earns 48,000 rupees a month. Now, that's a pretty good salary. And any Indian wouldn't mind starting out with that salary.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fact number 2. Only 10% of the teachers pass the teacher's eligibility test. So not only are they absent and not teaching, but they also are not really competent. The third fact is that less than half the children in the 5th class, 5th grade, can read or do arithmetic from a class 2 text. Fact 4, that India's children ranked 73rd out of 74 countries in the international PISA test of reading, science, and arithmetic. That is to say that only country ahead of India, we were ahead of, was Kyrgyzstan. Imagine a country with such an intellectual heritage, such culture. One of the fastest growing economies in the world, but our children came 73 out of 74 in the PISA test. Fact 5, as a result of this terrible situation in government schools, 2.5 crore children left government schools and joined private schools between 2011 and 2018. I mean, it is a tribute to the parents who didn't just sit around to see this rot. They decided to do something about it. And you know, when you can get a free education in a government school free midday meal, free uniform, free books, they decided to pay hard-earned money to send their children to a government school. So, in fact, what has happened today is that this trend is continuing, and 47% of India's children are now in private schools. And private schools are not elite schools like Doon School or Mayo or Wellams.
Yes.
These are schools that charge 500 rupees a month. In other words, 50% of the parents in private schools pay a fee of less than 500 rupees a month, and 70% pay a fee of less than 1,000 rupees a month. The problem is, even with private schools, they are not very good. They're not very good, and that's why you see these long queues every year at school opening time.
Yes, sir.
Queues of parents waiting to get their child into a good government school. And most of them will not succeed. And it's heartbreaking sight to see these parents begging the school to take their child in.
Yes, sir.
And so, why are there no good private schools? Well, the reason is that it is very difficult to open a private school. There's a real license raj in opening a private school. Here in Delhi, you need something like 39 permissions to start a school. And in many states, it's 120 pieces of paper you need to start a school. And a lot of these papers you get by paying a bribe. So a good, idealistic, young person who wants to start a school, he has to bribe to start a school. So where is that idealism? So who starts a lot of the private schools? Politicians. They are people who are willing. Politicians don't have to bribe, but businessmen have to bribe. So you have the wrong kind of people starting schools. And so even the private schools are not very good. And on the other hand, the government schools are closing down because there aren't any students left. They're all moving to these mediocre private schools. So the interesting thing, of course, is that because the private schools, what you have is a situation where you have too many teachers in government schools because there are not enough students. And so the cost to the state of running the government school system is very high. Basically, a private school gives the same or better education at 1/3 the cost than a government school. So now, unfortunately, the new education policy has not addressed itself to these hard facts. And today, a private school is not considered, we have the law actually does not allow because of this prejudice against private schools, there is a belief in India that only education should be given by government schools.
Yes, sir.
At the same time, government schools have failed, and even parents know it, but the ministry doesn't believe it. And so, what is the answer? What is the answer? That the answer, I believe, is one, to make it easier to open a private school so that young entrepreneurs, young idealistic teachers will be able to open a school.
Yes, sir.
And secondly, we should recognize that the government's job is not to run schools. The government job is to govern. And govern means to regulate education, to fund education, but not necessarily to run schools.
Yes, sir.
Now, government job is to make sure there are roads, but the government doesn't build every road. You have private contractors building roads.
Yes.
Similarly, the government should, in my view, give money to every child as a scholarship.
Yes.
And when every child in India reaches the age of 5, they should get a scholarship to have to go to a school that they want to go. And so poor parents who have, but this is the whole idea of, in fact, the idea was mooted during Mr. Bajpayee's government, very seriously mooted, that fund children, don't fund schools.
Yes, sir.
And give the choice to the parent which school the child should go to. And so the idea is this: if the government puts all the money that it has into funding students, and if they decide to go to a government school, then that school will get more money, because the money will come. Teachers' salaries will not be paid by the state, it will be paid by the fees of the students. So there'll be a competition between government schools, private schools. Teachers will show up. Teachers will teach with inspiration, because the more students they get in their school, the better off the school will be, and the better off the teacher will be as well. So this idea is that eventually those schools which are government schools can also be given to private entrepreneurs, or even the state can run them. There's no reason, but it should not be the same person who's regulating education who's doing it. And that's the good thing they've done. They've created this.
Yeah.
So, I just want to spend a few more minutes to talk about this hypocrisy in India about private education. Private education is based on a lie. A private school is not supposed to make a profit.
Yes.
And yet all private schools make a profit.
On the same line, I did have a question asking, if the privatization of education applies, then wouldn't that be commercialization?
Well, I personally don't think commercialization is bad. You go to the market every day, right? And you buy things, and if you're satisfied, if you have choice, you buy a particular bag or a particular dress, and you can choose. And all I'm suggesting is, and the quality, the person who's selling the product cares for you. Now, does the teacher care for you in a government school when she's absent? Does the teacher care for the child when she's not teaching, when she should be teaching with inspiration? So there's nothing wrong with making a profit. Nothing wrong. And we have to, 9 out of 10 countries, top 10 countries in the world, allow for profit education. Even China allows it. In India, we have this hypocrisy when all schools actually make a profit. but it's not allowed. So we have to get over this idea that there should be only not-for-profit schools. And so this business of chupke chupke, chori chori, that is hypocrisy. And what kind of example are we setting for our children when we have this kind of blatant falsehood in this whole system? So the benefit of allowing for-profit schools will also be a lot of capital will come in. Good entrepreneurs will come in. And good entrepreneurs will then create better schools. And there'll be investment in technology. And you know, there's a lot of new technology that is helping today. For example, every Indian child wants to learn English. And you can just download an app on your smartphone. The app can be Hello English. The app can be eGuru. The app can be Bolo English Bolo, Google Bolo,
Yes.
Google Bolo. There are many such apps. And by downloading an app, within 3 months, the child is speaking fluent English with a vocabulary of 750 to 1,000 words. So there is a way to, you know, all we should aim for ultimately is that good schools come up.
Yes, sir.
And by competition between government and private schools, the government schools will improve. Otherwise, the teachers won't get their salaries.
Right.
If the students don't bring their scholarships.
Yes, sir.
So there'll be a lot of benefits. Parents will be happier with more choice. School principals won't be called thieves, commercializers, etc. And so I believe we should amend the RTE law and amend it to allow for-profit schooling. And the economy will gain, the finances will gain, because that you can give the same education in a private school at 1/3 the cost of a government school.